Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Martin, it's always really exciting to listen to you. But I have to confess that perhaps for the first time, maybe it's because where I was yesterday, listening to you got me more and more worried. And as I wanted to get inspired by the amazing stories, there was a sense of a gap inside. Yesterday, I'm sorry I arrived late. Yesterday, I came to present at the Munich Security Conference, which is meeting today until tomorrow. And this is the biggest defense convening in the world. And tomorrow, Vice President Biden is going to meet Angela Merkel to talk about the Ukraine. Because the Pentagon has now decided that it's very likely that they want to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. And if that happens, Europe will face a very difficult escalation of the conflict with nuclear-armed superpowers that it's even more risky than it was during the Cold War. And so as we talked about, in that sort of world, we talked about the acceleration of resource scarcity and security and how that is driving a greater competition around the world. Big commodity groups, mining, infrastructure, soybean, are in a bit of a pole position to see how we access different resources around the world. I feel that a lot of the excitement that we feel about solutions on the ground, which is the thing that matters, is things that have a face and a name, are under great pressure, and tsunamis that will basically carry all of that away, potentially. I hope not. I really hope not. But I'm excited, and at the same time, I got more and more worried. And so the real question is, as we have the ideas, we know what we have to do, don't we? We have the tools, we have the technologies. We heard from a lot of people that we can do a lot of stuff with our phones. My question is, are we going to do it? Is this going to happen? And I am quite worried that that may not be the case. Right? And so I want to say two things. First is that I want to tell you why this Swiss chocolate and others hold a key for how we may transform these global powerful markets to embrace sustainability. The second is how we're going to use what I think is a mind-blowing risk management tool to get global corporates, global CEOs that are making decisions about asset allocation, are making decisions about political relationships with governments, and we're going to move heads of state to really embrace sustainability. And the reason for that is because countries are facing the perfect storm of pressures. It's no longer just about poverty, and it's no longer about water stress. It's no longer about exposure to climate change. This is a country visual. It is the perfect storm of pressures that no one really knows how to understand or how to address. And the bad thing is that as countries depend on one another for resources, these pressures are today triggers for geopolitical risks. And so, ladies, gentlemen, I think that sustainability is the new driver of geopolitical risk, and companies and governments are paying attention. Now, what have we done? We've created this risk dashboard that has basically said it is necessary to begin to connect the silos of resource risks, of what is really the headline risks that companies at the board level, that heads of state at the cabinet level are paying attention to. And we need to understand what is happening with electricity stability, and that is connected to fiscal stress, and that is connected to youth unemployment. But we also need to begin to bring sustainability pressures and begin to see that water stress will affect electricity generation in places like Brazil, with 70% dependent on hydropower. We need to understand what is the exposure to extreme weather events, and therefore position climate change. And obviously, land tenure issues, deforestation, as well as food security, which after the Arab Spring, every company understands is a major driver of political risk. Yeah. Now, this is the resulting visual. It's a risk visual in the sense that more means higher pressure, right? And this visual here is the combined results for the 9 biggest emerging economies, the aspiring emerging powers: Brazil, China, India, Russia, Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey. And what do you see? You see you see a combination of pressures. You see that deforestation driven by poor land tenure is converging with issues of water scarcity and pollution. You see the difficulty to sustain domestic electricity generation, and you also see in green a high dependence on imported grains. And what does that mean? Right? When China grows, as I will see in a minute, they are more and more dependent on importing grains from other places, and soybean production in Paraguay and Argentina and Brazil, key producing regions that are feeding the world, as Martin said, are more under pressure, and the Chaco will be more under pressure, right? And so what are the immediate three takeaways from this? Essentially, there's a growing complexity of pressures that need to be managed in a totally different way. The second is that there's risk exposure in emerging economies, and this is a trigger for geopolitical risk. And the third, and I think most important, window of opportunity is that this creates systemic risks for business. Companies that sometimes unwittingly end up having a major reputational risk because of land tenure conflict, because they've made, I think you mentioned, they've made big commitments in the UN that we're going to have zero deforestation in our supply chains, and guess what? I'm going to show you in a second how that is going to be very difficult to achieve. So here we have a big opportunity, which is to get the fundamentals of risk management and bring a notion of sustainability to drive sustainability innovation. It's the only way in which companies and politicians will be able to avert some of the crises that are coming up. And so how do we drive action with this? Yeah? We've just launched 3 days ago a big report called the Earth Security Index 2015, which you can download it from the web right now. And we use these country dashboards to look at strategic commodity markets that will shape many of these pressures at the global level. They are shaping the forces that will affect what happens in Paraguay, because this is such an export-driven economy, right? We are looking at the most complicated sustainability challenges in the world and saying, these are the dynamics of risk, and it is possible to drive very specific risk management actions that will actually build resilience and build sustainability, and this is the only way to think about risk management going forward. And so let me talk about Swiss chocolate, yeah? This is the risk visual for Switzerland. Everybody here, who is Swiss here? Many of you are Swiss. And so, I'm not Swiss, but I'm Argentinian, actually. And my sense is always that Swiss feel they're sort of quite self-sufficient in a sense. We are not dependent on outsiders. In fact, we don't want outsiders to come, right? So we're going to close the borders. Now, what you're seeing in blue is that Switzerland has an enormous virtual water footprint. What does that mean? It means that 80% of water consumption in Switzerland is occurring outside the country. And why is this? You also see the green wedge is because Switzerland is very dependent on importing grain commodities, and those grain commodities carry the water irrigated in the countries that sourced it, right? So when we looked at this and how do we drive action with all of this? We said, okay, what are the key commodities driving this water footprint? As you may be aware that in Switzerland today there's a very big discussion around the role of Switzerland as a global commodities hub. What is the responsibility that Switzerland has in the world? And so we looked at the list and we realized, well, you saw that before I was going to tell it, cocoa is one of the commodities that is a big representative of that water footprint, 16%. And we said, okay, where is this cocoa coming from? And that's the list. And we found that over 50% comes from two countries, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. In fact, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire supply 60% of the world's cocoa. And this is supplied by 1.6 million smallholder farmers who live in absolute poverty and have never seen a bar of chocolate in their life. Can you believe that? So what we said is, clearly, what is the diplomatic risk for country Switzerland, where Swiss chocolate is a part of the country brand? What are you going to do about that? And so clearly, we obviously looked at what the companies are doing, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we said, clearly, this is a challenge both for Swiss chocolate multinationals and the Swiss government, and that bridge that exists of actually companies doing their business and governments doing what governments do need to be overcome, and we need to be driving innovation in a new way. So we said, let's basically look at what is happening in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. What are the pressures? And what we found is something really, really mind-blowing, which is that in 5 years, 2020, these pressures and the pace of growth of demand for chocolate in emerging economies, China loves chocolate, India and Indonesia, Brazil, they love chocolate. This is amazing, and the industry today is at $9 billion, and it's going to grow. And as that grows, these pressures, the perfect storm of poverty, of climate change, of water, of productivity, is going to constrain supply to the point that in 5 years there's going to be a supply shortage. This is amazing, right? And so what we said is, okay, clearly, the first thing we need to do is to reimagine global interdependencies, right? And Switzerland needs to understand that it has a dependence on Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. I mean, this is just quite disruptive as an idea already. And we then said, which other Swiss companies in the 10 biggest confectionery companies by market cap, which are those that are Swiss-based? And so there they are. And then we looked at their programs. And then we said, clearly, in order to be able to avert the supply disruption, the supply shortage, you need to go beyond sustainability. You need to go beyond the sustainability programs. By the way, companies are doing great stuff. Yeah? There's an estimated $700 million committed to invest in sustainability in those countries. But it's just not enough. And so we thought that actually, in order to overcome poverty, it's not enough to go fair trade. It's not enough to pay producers a bit more. We need to close that gap of enormous market growth in emerging economies and extreme poverty in the producers. And the only way of doing that is putting the farmers at the center of the revenue of the wealth generation model, making farmers part owners of that growth. And that has been a very small company. You might know it's called Divine Chocolate. It's the only fair trade company in the world that is 45% owned by the smallholders in Ghana. Now, this is a global brand, expanding in emerging markets, over $10 million turnover, that is 45% owned by the farmers. Now, obviously, the companies told us, the big Swiss companies said, well, we can't do that. Yeah, fair enough. But we think that the principle of moving from what we call moving from the share value to shared equity is fundamental in order to change how global capitalism is going to be able to address more of the very specific things that Martin has talked about. Yeah? And we call these blueprints. Yeah? They're blueprints that show the way for how the exposure of governments and the exposure of companies can be overcome with very specific targeted innovations. Let me talk about, and all of a sudden Martin has a lot to do with this presentation. I don't know why, it's Paraguay's there. This is the other thing I was talking about. Yeah? What is happening with China is that China has changed its strategy, right? The Communist Party last year changed the law that said that China would be self-sufficient on all the commodities. And they said, we don't have enough water, and so we need to make a decision. We're going to drop those commodities that are not essential for food security, which is key to our political stability, and we're going to import them, especially those that are water intensive, like soy. Yeah? And so this has just happened. And so China has been importing a lot of soy, in particular from South America, but it's going to import even more. In the next 10 years, it's going to be enormous, because now it's a market strategy. So the first thing that happened is that China said, actually, we don't want to be passive importers anymore. We're going to buy commodity traders. We're going to compete in the market. We're going to set the prices and policies. We're going to own ports in Paraguay and in Brazil and in Argentina. So that is really transforming the market. I mean, everything is being transformed. This is why I was a bit worried. Yeah? But what is happening in South America is even more amazing, right? Because Brazil more or less had it under control. I mean, actually, since 2006, soybean has not been associated with deforestation in the Amazon, right? There are other problems, of course, but that was more or less under control. Now, what the problem Brazil has, it has logistical bottlenecks, right? And that is bad for business. Companies are finding it very difficult to invest in big agribusiness in Brazil for that reason. Enormous queues in the ports, enormous queues of the ships and the trucks. And so all of a sudden, Argentina and Paraguay, that have, as you can see in blue, much weaker rule of law and much weaker government effectiveness, have become major producers and exporters of soybean. And actually, the big players have become integrated across the borders, right? And so today, Cargill is the biggest producer in Brazil, in Paraguay, and Argentina. It's diversified. It's producing different types of soybean in the different countries. And so when we talk to Cargill, And we say, your CEO last September was taking a picture with the UN the Secretary General, and make the big commitment. It's amazing, global companies are going to drive sustainability. Well, no, they're not going to drive the big sustainability, because you're operating across borders in very different governance settings, and you're totally exposed. So, but actually, there's one thing you can do. Yeah? What you need to do as a global company is to become more proactive in strengthening forest policy. And unless you do that, your CEO will have enormous reputational challenges, probably in 2015. Yeah? So this is just giving you a sense of how I think, with a new understanding of risk, and a new understanding of global market interdependencies, a new understanding of key global players, we can drive a new agenda and then bring some of the tools that you guys are using. And I've run out of time, but the other story I wanted to tell you is what we're doing in Southeast Asia around transboundary haze. And of course, in our work in Indonesia, we've come across WRI and a number of other really great stuff that is happening with the tools. The question is, who will have the incentive to use them? And so we've looked at the different companies, and we've said, actually, these are the 25 big conglomerates that are actually listed in the stock exchanges of Malaysia, Indonesia, and Singapore that are facing enormous legal challenges because the operation of land assets in Indonesia, and you know this very well, is creating an enormous blanket of smog that goes to Singapore and is creating health risks. And now any citizen in Singapore has no leverage in Indonesia at all. It's national sovereignty. But they've allowed any citizen to take the multinationals to court and create class actions because of health problems. So these are the companies that are therefore exposed. And again, very specific recommendations we have made, and you should read them because I'm probably running out of time, to basically use this notion of interdependence and risk management as a driver of sustainability in the 21st century. Yeah. Let me leave it there, and I would be really happy to keep exchanging thoughts with you. This is my email address. Let's just keep the conversation going, and thank you very much for having me here.